Hi, you're listening to Dr. Jo. I have over 25 years experience working in sports psychology, working with teams such as the North Queensland Cowboys and the Townsville Fire. You're listening in to the Physical Performance Show.
Failure is not an option.
I've had my ups and my downs.
I think it's an absolutely breakthrough experience.
Welcome to the Physical Performance Show, the show designed to inspire the pursuit of your physical best performance. I'm your host, Brad Beer. Listen in as we delve into how the world's top physical performers achieve their success, as well as the highs, the lows, and the journey of getting there. Let's get ready, set, let's go. Welcome back, or welcome to the Physical Performance Show, brought to you by PhysioCrem and Pogo Physio. I'm Brad Beer, sports physiotherapist by trade and training and founder of Pogo Physio. Each week, we'll aim to bring you a range of episodes, including featured performers, expert editions, interest editions, and coaches' corner editions. This week, we continue on an expert edition theme, and I'll share with you a recent conversation I had with leading sports psychologist Dr. Jo Lukins. Dr. Jo Lukins spends her day inside the heads of individuals, some of the world's and Australia's leading athletes, teams and organisations, seeking to understand what makes them tick and assisting them to reach their potential. Dr. Lukins has been described as a psychological Indiana Jones, and it's no wonder with a PhD to her name and a 25-year clinical psychology depth of experience. Dr. Jo has been the founding sports psychologist for the Australian Rugby League team, the North Queensland Premiership winning Cowboys, and also the Townsville Fire Basketball Team. Dr. Jo regularly delivers programs in resilience and expert performance for the Australian Defence Force. And just recently, Dr. Jo released her first book titled The Elite. Think like an athlete, succeed like a champion. 10 things the elite do differently. It has a foreword by Australian Rugby League great Jonathan Thurston, in which Jonathan writes, "Your mental approach can be your greatest asset or your biggest downfall." High-performing athletes soon learn that you need to invest as much time on your mental approach as the physical part of your game to perform at your best. I love the chapter titles of Dr. Jo's book, The Elite. They include chapters such as Take Your Mark, Mindset Master Plan, The Bannister Effect, Systems in Place, Tell It Straight, In Your Corner, The Gratitude Attitude, Enjoy the Ride, and 2 chapters that we touch on in today's conversation, the concepts of embracing the suck, subtitled Being Comfortable with the Uncomfortable, and from The Elite, Chapter 8, Life Balance BS, in which Jo shares around the concept that why chasing balance is a myth and why it in fact may cause stress when seeking to pursue your own physical best or your best in any area in life. In addition to touching on 2 of the chapters in Jo's recently released book, Jo also shares around the role of psychology in injury rehabilitation, why people who are optimistic tend to do better in life, but in what situations optimism may in fact not be favourable. Dr. Jo charges us to evaluate success, not just simply to evaluate failures. We also touch on the concept of effort and why enhancing self-esteem through the right coaching cues is so paramount. This is a terrific psychological deep dive, so jump in, take notes with Dr. Jo Lukins on this expert edition. Let's go. Dr. Jo Lukins, welcome to the Physical Performance Show.
Thank you for having me.
Dr. Jo, it's been a busy time for you with the release of your first book, The Elite. So firstly, congratulations.
Oh, thank you very much for that.
And it seems to be the distilling of really 25 years plus, clinical experience into X amount of pages. So really looking forward to exploring some of the contents of the book today as we record. But before we go too far, before we get context to your world, what's one thing that Dr. Jo Lukins is learning at the moment?
Oh, there's so many things out there. I think what I've actually been learning is a lot about myself through writing the book, that it's interesting to remind yourself when you challenge yourself with a new project that you go through some of the vulnerabilities that everyone goes through. So it's reminding me of the challenge of extending yourself and being gentle on yourself while you do that. So it's been a real journey for me.
Yeah, were there times where you weren't gentle on yourself by the sounds of it?
There may be. I know I can say this amongst friends. There may have been one or two times where I really did look at the underside of my desk and wondered if I could fit under there. But I guess that's one of the things, isn't it, that when we set ourselves goals, set ourselves challenges, and there's risks with that. And so it's navigating through that pathway each time we do it and extend ourselves. And
you have come out the other side, and it must feel great.
It does. I have lived to tell the tale. The book is out in its physical reality and its electronic one. So I'm very pleased to say that I have survived the tale and navigated the pathway over the years of, like you said, bringing together the information that I've been fortunate enough to find out through working with elite athletes.
And the subtitle of the book, Jo, Think Like an Elite Athlete, Succeed Like a Champion, 10 Things the Elite Do Differently. So let's explore some of those today. But to give context to your world, Dr. Jo, sports clinical psychologist, you've had many experiences, many years in working with elite athletes, and one thing that jumps out to me is your time with the North Queensland Rugby League Cowboys team. So can you put us a little bit in perspective around how you got into this field to start with, and then where your work's taken you to date?
Sure. So I think it's always interesting when you look at someone's career progression, particularly those serendipitous moments where we thought we were doing one thing and we found ourselves doing something else. So my high school journey started on the Sunshine Coast. And when I finished high school, I was quite determined that I would be joining the Queensland Police Service. That was what I wanted to do at that point in time. And I was guided towards doing some university study before taking that on. So I decided to do psychology, and through the guidance officer at school was told that I needed to study psychology at James Cook University in Townsville. That was not actually true. I could have actually gone to Brisbane. I didn't know that at the time. I was quite naive to the whole university process, being the first in my family to go. So the story would be very different if that hadn't happened, because what that meant for me was I came to Townsville, studied in Townsville, and then what I found was a great land of opportunity. So by the time I finished my degree, I think I'd forgotten about joining the police force, because I became very interested in performance, and particularly in terms of sporting performance. So my honours research was with kids and looking at children's understanding of success and failure in sport and how that impacts in terms of their confidence and their self-esteem. So that's where I started there. Started working at the university then. I got a job straight after I finished my initial studies, and then timing was right. So what happened professionally is psychology shifted into a new world of what was called positive psychology, which we might talk about. And in addition to the field shifting and changing, a new team came to town. I was very fortunate that I had all the optimism of someone in their early 20s. So when they were looking for a psychologist in 1996, I put myself forward and managed to get that gig, which was great. That was back in the day when Graham Lowe was the coach. And I always remember that very first meeting with him where he said, "Jo, I think I'm looking for a combination between Sigmund Freud and Lois Lane." So I never quite knew what that was, but I managed to survive that first year. And look, it was an interesting time. And I think for anyone's listening who's ever really felt extended in terms of what they're doing, I was the same age as the players when I started. And I really had that very common experience that we see with recent graduates where I genuinely thought I knew nothing. But it turns out that you do take on board more than you think. So I've been with the club since 1996, so it's quite a long time, obviously. And what has happened over those years is I've been very fortunate with the athletes that I've worked with and the coaches and the whole professional world that goes with, in that instance, with rugby league. And what that's meant for me is, I've been able to grow as a professional, and I've been able to witness a team and a club through all of the permutations of what it is to be a professional team. So we've been to grand finals, we've won grand finals, we've lost grand finals, we've been bottom of the table, all those kind of trials and tribulations. So there's so much to be learnt from those opportunities, and I've been really grateful for that, because I've been able to integrate that into my work. I teach at the university up here, and I also work with the Townsville Fire for those who follow the WNBL, and we've had great success at a national level there in terms of winning grand finals there. So, it's an amazing opportunity that you don't often get. So I've been very appreciative of the experience.
Oh, so much there, Jo. Of all the experiences you've had, which, as you say, are many and varied, the highs, the lows, and, this is a subtitle of this show, the highs, lows and learn-ins. What would you say, is there one experience or one memory, it's very difficult to answer, I appreciate this, that sort of stands out as where you really saw the effect that your role could have on either an individual athlete or a team at large?
Yeah, I guess that's a great question to ask, and particularly when you've done something for a while, I think it's really valuable to reflect on your career and what's happened. I guess I've always been really mindful that the role of psychology in sport is part of the puzzle, but I don't think it's all of the puzzle. I think it was Greg Norman that once asked the question about when did a sports psychologist last win the Open, which I think is a very good question. So I guess I've always been mindful to hope that I've made a contribution, but never taken the credit nor the responsibility for the outcome, which kind of makes me sound a little bit like a fence sitter. But I do think that, I'm very firm that all athletic success is ultimately about the athlete performing, and there are so many parts of the puzzle that contribute towards it in terms of the physiology of the athletes, in terms of their mental game, in terms of their opportunities and their circumstances and so forth. So I guess, I always appreciate when athletes come back and say, thank you, that was helpful. And I even, had an athlete this morning that I crossed in passing who was in a particular place when I started the conversation with them very informally, and then was in a different place by the end of the conversation. So that the thought that you can positively contribute to someone's well-being and performance is it's why I do what I do. And I know in your work as well, it's when you work in a helping profession, which is largely what we do, knowing that you've helped is very, very rewarding.
Gosh, I really love what you said. You hope you've made a contribution, but you're not taking responsibility for the outcome. And would that infer that the responsibility is always going to rest squarely with the individual, be it the athlete or whoever it is that's receiving the input?
Yes, yeah, I do think that's really important. I think that we can only all take responsibility for our own behaviours, but we'd be silly to think that there aren't people around us that can help and contribute to us developing and growing who we are. And I think when we can, as humans, be understanding of that, and particularly, you'll probably hear me say it lots of times, be grateful for that. I do think gratitude is one of those key things for all of us, that when we are mindful in our lives about how fortunate we all are, then it makes it so much easier to go out there and to perform well. And there's great research now linking gratitude and performance. So that's an area that I've always found fascinating.
And I've noted that down, Dr. Jo, because I think that would be great to plumb into a little. It's chapter 10 of your book, The Gratitude Attitude. So let's go deeper on that shortly with the link to performance. Jo, just recoursing back there for a moment, you mentioned your honours project was around children's self-esteem and their success in sport. I'm paraphrasing there, but just briefly, what did you learn, and what could you share and encourage listeners of this show around who either have children or perhaps are adolescents out there looking to maximise their potential, whatever that looks like? Yes,
so thank you for that opportunity. So it was a long time ago, but gee, it was a fun project. So it was my honours research in the fourth year of my degree. So we had to be able to put something together that was fairly compact in terms of time. So I was quite interested to explore with children, first of all, their understanding about what success looked like, because there was a little bit of a gap in the literature back then, and this was like 1990. There was a gap in the literature because the assumption in a lot of the research was that you were successful if you won, and if you lost, you had failed. And, of course, that is not the message that we want to give anyone. You know, we want people to understand that there are times, you know, usually only 1, 2 or 3 people can take the dice, depending on what the sport is. So you can be successful through your achievements and personal best and so forth. And so what I was interested to see is if children could discern the difference between having a satisfied win, a dissatisfied win, a satisfied loss, and a dissatisfied loss. So I wanted to see if they could make that distinction, because it was interesting that the literature didn't seem to do that. So what I found was I was very, very brave, because my population that I looked at was children between the ages of 8 and 12. There is no tougher research population than 8 to 12-year-olds, because they certainly tell you how it is. And I always remember, if I could tell you one quick story, I had this fabulous taxonomy by a researcher called Viner that basically said that most of us attribute our outcomes either to our ability, to the amount of effort we've put in, to how difficult the task is, or how lucky we've been. And that's pretty much it. So I went there as a very green researcher with my taxonomy of my 4 things. And I remember sitting down with the first child, who was about 10, and I said, can you tell me about a time when you won? I think it was when you won and you weren't very happy about it, or maybe, yeah, I think that was what it was. And the child looked at me and he said, yes, I can remember that, and described it to me. And I said, great. I said, why do you think that happened? You know, ready with my taxonomy to tick one of those 4 things off. And he said, well, there were no icy cups that day. And I thought, yes, Viner, you weren't factoring in icy cups, were you? That's the problem. Is that eight-year-olds don't read research papers, so they don't know how they're supposed to respond. So it threw my data out from the very first question. But so what I was interested in looking at, coming back to the actual research itself, was that understanding. Interestingly, the younger children, it was much more clear-cut, black and white. So you tended to win and it was good, and you tended to lose and that was bad. And that's what a lot of them would report. By the time the children were getting older, and certainly around that 12 years of age, they had a much more sophisticated understanding about what the outcomes in sport looked like. So the notion that you could win but not be happy with the performance, or not feel satisfied with it, or the notion that you might not win but there's still much to be gained from it. So that was one of the things that I looked at. And the other thing that I looked at that I was very interested in is how that all related to self-esteem for kids. The first thing, and again, another part of the research that wasn't as I expected, I learned a lot about expectations in that project as well, was the population were children who were competing at Little Athletics. So, you know, a whole range of sports that the kids get to do there. And across, I think I interviewed 120 students, children, and I had, and I'm pleased to say, a very small percentage of that group of kids had low self-esteem, according to the measure that I used, which was great in terms of, you know, how these kids felt about themselves. It was not so good in terms of my research, because again, anyone who's ever done statistics will know that when you've got, you know, 110 in one category and 10 in the other, it doesn't help you out with doing your analysis. So I then went to a school population where I compared non-athletes with athletes, and there was much more diversity. So I knew straight away it wasn't the scale, that there was something about these kids. Now, whether it was kids with higher self-esteem were going into the sport, or the sport itself was contributing to self-esteem, I wasn't able to discern in that study. That would have been a much larger longitudinal study. But by and large, what we found was that children with high self-esteem tended to attribute their successes to characteristics about them. You know, so I tried hard. Might be something that they might say, whereas the children who had performed well but had low self-esteem would say things like, oh, I was just lucky, or it wasn't a very hard race because everyone else weren't very good to start with. So there were very different responses according to self-esteem. So one of the take-home messages that I've been very firm on my whole career around children and sport is that one of the most important things to emphasize with children is their effort. So if I'm a young tennis player, I'm 12 years old, and let's just say I haven't been doing it for very long and my skill level isn't particularly high, and I am only praised on the things I do well, then you can take a seat and get yourself a coffee, because you're not going to have to say too much. But if you pass comment on and praise me on my effort, then from the second I step on the court, that's something that I can control. So I think that what we see with self-esteem for everyone, but particularly with children when we're looking at enhancing self-esteem for people, recognising effort, because effort is the one thing. It doesn't matter if I'm not particularly good at art at school or maths at school or whatever it is, but gee, I can try hard. And so when it's the effort that is rewarded, that's what helps keep kids motivated and helps them move forward. Otherwise they can become quite disillusioned by what's going on, and then they can give up more easily.
Gosh, there's so many extensions of that to our lives in general.
Yes, that's right. And if I can just add one point to that, Brad, as well, is it's interesting when I talk to people in general about the younger generation. I'm making myself sound very old by saying that, but I'm old enough that I can say it like that, is that the millennials and the children that are coming in behind them are often criticised, for a sense of entitlement and a whole range of other things. I think there's many fantastic characteristics about people born through that generation. But one of the mistakes that we made through the 80s and the 90s is we recognised the importance of self-esteem for people and self-worth, and then we got a little bit confused as to how we enhance that. And we enhance self-esteem by putting kids in a position where they can try hard, possibly experience success, and importantly experience disappointment, and if you want to use the term failure, but and can find out that they can survive it. But where we came unstuck is where there was a lot of thinking around, well, self-esteem is built by knowing that you're good at something, and so that whole generation of everyone gets a medal and let's applaud everything, and then we end up with a generation that 80% of the population think they're above average. It all comes unstuck, and it's largely about the way we've approached that. So I think when we can get, particularly if we're talking about children here, getting them to reflect on, well, how hard did you try in that situation? What did you find challenging, and what did you enjoy about that? And what I noticed was that you were working really hard towards your serve, or whatever it is. So noticing effort and but more importantly, getting the child to do it, because that's the most reinforcing, and then they're not too reliant on that external feedback.
Yeah, brilliant. And if you could go back, rewind the clock for the 80s, 90s, parents raising children, what would be your solitary piece of advice to them?
Well, I guess the key piece of advice around that is to acknowledge that effort comes from within and failure is okay. That we have, and look, I say this to you as a parent. I have a 16-year-old and a 12-year-old, and I don't want my kids to be upset or, I'd like them to do well at things and all the rest of it. And the tendency when that's your focus for your kids is that we make it life easier for them. We save them from the distress of, heaven forbid, losing at something or not making a team, or then we march down to the school and we instead of backing up the teacher, we attack the teacher, those sorts of things. And I think it's no different to what we want from our athletes. You need to become comfortable being uncomfortable. Not all of life is comfortable. So when we can do that, we're setting ourselves up to be so much more resilient and face life, and the Cowboys didn't win last week. So test of resilience is, how do you cope with that? And of course you find ways. And if we don't have those in resilience, then we flounder.
And I know in Chapter 7, Embrace the Suck, it's titled, this dives into this concept of being comfortable with the uncomfortable. And I mean, in my life lived to date, I've always reflected, I've always learnt more in the disappointments or the failures than whenever it's been going well. Is that a fair, from a clinical perspective, is that a fair general assessment?
What I would say is I think there are plenty of learning opportunities through disappointment. It's just a question of whether or not we give ourselves permission to see it. So if I don't achieve my outcome and then I put my lip in the bendies and suck my thumb a bit and get, don't cope with it, and maybe blame others and all the rest of it, then I probably won't learn too much. But if I can, and there's that challenge of holding up the mirror and go, rightio, what happened there? That didn't work so well, so how can I do it differently next time? How can I forgive myself that it didn't go that well this time? All those sorts of things that we can do. Those, it isn't, it's not my phrase to take credit for, but, that notion that it's not so much what happens to us, but it's how we respond to it. It's so important.
And to look for the learnings through the disappointments, Dr. Jo, is that the process of reflection?
Yeah, look, I think that it is. And I think that when we reflect, the other thing to kind of the counterbalance for what we're talking about there is, I think that when we do anything, so whether it be a sporting performance, whether it be something at work that we're doing, whether it be something in our relationships or with our family, and we are sitting back and thinking to ourselves, how did that go? I think it's important to think about, well, what do we learn about ourselves in the situation? That's important. But also, what went well? And that's one of the things I don't think we do as much as we could. I was quite interested with a team that I worked with a couple of years ago now, where I noticed that after a loss, there was a lot of reflection on how the team had gone. And in fact, it probably wasn't going so well because the team was spending a lot of time sort of watching video of all the mistakes that they made, which is kind of psychology 101, that you don't want to spend too much time watching mistakes, because then what you see is what you get, and then you go out and you repeat them. And what I also noticed, though, was that the team meetings after a win were pretty short. It was almost phew, that's good, we had a win, excellent, okay, let's go on to next week. And I think there's also much for us to learn when we've been successful, and I think sometimes we don't take that opportunity to learn from it either, because whatever you did to get that win or get that time or whatever it is that you're working towards, you want to keep repeating it so that you keep improving and keep doing well. So that's the other thing that we can do, is if you have just done something, and whatever it is, and it went the way you wanted it to, there'll always be some positives to gain from it. And not only is it good for our sense of well-being to reflect what's gone well, but it's important for our learnings as well. And we tend to, really dwell on the mistakes, which is part of the natural human negativity bias that tends to be there. But there's also much from things of what went well.
Dr. Jo, you just mentioned the negativity bias. That jumps out. I know I'm wired as an optimist, and I know that maybe has its shortcomings at times, particularly if you ask my wife. But in terms of this negativity bias, is that something, can you explain that a little bit more? I haven't heard of that before.
Yeah, so the negativity bias is generally considered to be a tendency that I'm certainly not going to say all, particularly as you've just declared yourself an optimist. And, there is a tendency that people have to seek out the negative. So the best example I can give is, let's say you were working on a project at work and you got two pieces of feedback, and one bit said, this is what you've done well. The other bit said, this is what you haven't done well. We tend to give more weight to this is what you didn't do well. We tend to pay more attention to negative feedback. We tend to seek it out more, and it carries more weight. So if I was giving a seminar, for example, I gave one this morning, if there was an evaluation form filled out and 20 people filled it in, I might quickly scan through the feedback as I'm walking back to my car, and there might be 18 people that said, yep, that was great, and there might be 2 people that went, that was, it was a bit so-so. The 2 surveys that said that was a bit so-so will gain more weight even than the 18 that said, yep, she was great. So we do tend to have this bias. And a really interesting piece of research that a psychologist looked at several years ago tried to understand what does balance it out. So what that means is, if I've just said to you that, one negative thing does not equal one positive thing, what does one positive thing equal? And it was referred to as the Lasada line. And from memory, I'm trying to remember now if it was 2.7 or 2.9 was the conclusion with this very complicated formula, which basically said you need, say, 2.7 pieces of positive information to outweigh a negative. So I always say to people, if you can find a way to find 0.7 of a positive bit of feedback, let me know, because I still don't know how you do that. But essentially the message was, it was, let's round it up and say that it was, about 3 to 1. Now, that's just for everything to be neutral. So they then looked at, what does it take to flourish? What does it take to do well? And this is where anyone who is listening to this, and particularly if anyone's writing notes, please do not write this number down. But the number was 13 to 1. So what that was actually saying is, to flourish, you need to seek out the positive to really be sort of bouncing along and doing well. And the reason I don't want people to get too caught up in the number is, it means, if you wake up tomorrow morning and 3 things go wrong, I don't want you searching for 39 positive things before you even get into your car to go to work. But the message, and look, there's been debate over the Lasada line as well since that time and the formula that they use. The key message is, though, that it's not uncommon for people to seek out the negative. It's not uncommon for people to give it more weight. And what we know is that there is much to be gained in our lives through, as you said, the optimistic focus, seeking out the good, seeking out what goes well, and we see that through all the research in gratitude about, the benefits of noticing and savouring the things in our life that goes well. And in terms of our overall well-being as humans, let alone in terms of the impact it has on us in terms of performance, it's something very beneficial for us to do.
So interesting. And can people learn the skills of, obviously, I'm assuming they can, of becoming more optimistic, if you like?
Definitely. So there is a very large body of science dedicated to that very thing. And the beautiful thing about all of this is, and I often talk to people about, I should step back. So what we would talk about in psychology is the continuum of optimism to pessimism. So optimism is where you seek out the good, if we go with the Winnie the Pooh analogy, it's the Tiggers of the world. We assume everything's going to go well. We notice the positive, and we think that every cloud has a silver lining. Down the other end of the continuum, we have the Eeyores, that every silver lining has a cloud, that there's always something to go wrong and so forth. So what we see consistently in the research is that it's helpful in our lives to be more, and this is not a technical term, to be more tiggerish, to be more optimistic, that we find that when people experience an optimistic framework through which they view the world, they tend to do better in sport, in health, in business, in relationships, all of the key human dimensions. People tend to do better when they're optimistic. I often phrase it to people and say, look, if optimism, the whole notion of being optimistic doesn't appeal to you, then think in a way that's more helpful. So even if you've just been sat on your bum for something because you didn't go so well at something, what's the most helpful way to think now? What can you do about it? And we know that when people do that, they tend to perform better. Now, the good news is there's two bits of good news around all of this. The first thing is that there's good evidence-based science that says you can shift your attitude from being pessimistic up the optimism scale. So we can do that. But the other thing I would say to people is, regardless of where you would place yourself on the continuum today, let's assume that majority of people listening are adults, so you've been on the planet a little while, and you might say, oh, yeah, I'm probably about halfway. I'm sometimes positive, but sometimes I'm negative, or no, I'm a bit doom and gloom, I'm a bit negative. Regardless of where you place yourself on the continuum today, there was a time in your life when you were a tigger, when you were optimistic. And you have to go a long way back, and that's at around, this is making a couple of assumptions, but around 12 months of age, give or take. If you learnt to walk, if you think about that task, if you watch a young child learn how to walk, the only way they learn how to do it is they have to repeatedly fail. They get up, they fall down, they get up, they fall down, they get up, they fall down. And eventually they learn how to walk. If you've learnt to ride a bike, if you've learnt to do cursive writing, if you've learnt to button up your shirt, if you've learnt to clear hurdles on a track, if you can dribble a basketball without looking at it, all of those skills, you have to fail at it before you learn how to do it. So you can only do that with perseverance and optimism, hope that you're going to do well. And so that's all, the take home I say to people is that thinking in a way that's more helpful is beneficial for you in terms of all of your performance. It is a skill that can be learnt. And the only other thing I would add to it, because I've been talking for a little while now, the only other thing I would add to it is if you are, though, in a situation where there is a high level of risk, any situation where there's a high level of risk, and I'll just go with, because I live in North Queensland, so you've just found a mole on your arm and it's changed. If you're in a high level of risk, you need to pull back the optimism a little bit because she'll be right is not a good strategy with a high level of risk. I live in Townsville where we had the floods at the start of this year. She'll be right is not a good strategy if you're in a flood-prone area and they've just opened the dam gates, So you're flying a plane and one of the engines ices up. All of those are very obvious situations where you need to be cautious. That doesn't mean be pessimistic, but you can't. There are times when you can be too optimistic, so you just have to be mindful and sensible about how you approach those high-risk situations.
I know in my work as a sports physio, the research links optimism, the tendency of people to expect good things to happen to them to in rehabilitation terms to better outcomes. They still experience pain, but they just tend to be more flexible in dealing with it. So I've observed that over the years in the therapy room as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, your area of expertise it's particularly evident, and as you would have seen over the years, and you're the expert in this, but people's response to an injury and response to treatment options and so forth, your relative level of optimism or pessimism will influence your recovery.
Yeah, and Jo, on that, just briefly, a few concepts before we jump over to some of the concepts and chapters from the Elite, your book. Dealing with injury, what would be, and this is another 25 years plus of experience condensed into a sentence or two, but, for the listener of this show who's out there feeling a bit flat, I always say maybe the things that bring people in for physio is not the pain or the injury, it's the frustrations, fears and anxieties. So maybe they're experiencing either of those or all of those. What would be Dr. Jo, sports psychologist's advice to the person sidelined at the moment?
Okay, so the first thing is, I'm sorry to hear about your injury. That would be the first thing that I would, I'm a bit more of a weekend warrior than any sort of elite level of athlete, but I do understand the frustrations that go with injury. What I would also say, and as you've acknowledged, is that we quite often see for people a grief response to injury. So it's not uncommon to have a wave of emotions that might go through for you, regardless of your level of competition, or your status as an athlete, but the human experience of being injured and not being able to do what you would choose to do, and whether that be because of, prevents you from doing your sport or prevents you from doing your work. So the first thing I would say is that there's a very good chance that the emotions you are feeling are normal. That being said, I would keep an eye on them, and I would maybe get that checked by a professional if they are hanging around for a while. So if you feel, it's not uncommon for people to feel anxious or sad or depressed or, worried or frustrated or angry or, all of those kinds of things. But I would always say if they've been around for a little while, then to speak to your physio, to maybe think about seeing a psychologist, talk to your GP and say, look, I've been feeling like this and feeling like this for a while. So it's normal to go through a grief response. That being said, there's things that can be done to assist you through that. So I think that's an important thing to remember as well. I think it's really important to take the advice of your health professionals around, a graduated return to whatever it is that you're doing. And then there's those challenges of compliance with rehab, which is, I know there are figures on it, and you might have some more recent ones to hand about the actual compliance of patients when they're given instructions by their physiotherapist. And my understanding of the figures is they're not always that great. And that's because, we have the intention to do the behaviours, but, there's something that sometimes is missing between a good intention and actually doing, the time on the foam roller or the TheraBands or the whatever it is, or just the rest and the ice that we might need to do or whatever it is. So I think one of the key things from injury is that to remember that people matter and there's people around us that can support us. And I think that sometimes, even though it can feel like you might want to shut people out, we know that when we're under stress, the body secretes a lot of oxytocin, which is the love hormone, which seems to be the message from your body saying, go and find someone that can help you. And even if it's just someone who can sit with you and share your frustrations, or, or maybe you need someone who can give you some more informational support or whatever it's going to be. And that's what I talk about in the book. And there's a chapter there called In Your Corner. And it really comes from that key message that we get from positive psychology, that people matter, and it's our relationships that are important, and they help us feel good about who we are as people, and they help us in terms of our performance as well.
You're listening to Dr. Jo Lukins, sports psychologist and author of The Elite. Think like an athlete, succeed like a champion. On this, an expert edition. Support for today's show comes from PhysioCrem. Physio Creme is a topical massage cream containing natural plant-based ingredients, ideal for the temporary relief of muscular aches and pains. If you're conscious of what you put on your body, you'll be happy to know that Physio Creme does not contain parabens or hydroxybenzoates, and its non-greasy formula doesn't leave any sticky residue behind. Physio Creme can be found Australia-wide at your local Coles, chemist or health store, as well as their online store. They've offered a 20% generous discount to listeners of the Physical Performance Show. Simply use the coupon code POGO, P-O-G-O, when you shop at physiocreme.com.au to redeem this offer. That's physiocreme.com.au, physiocrem.com.au. Hurting Sucks and Physio Creme have got your back. Support for today's show also comes from Pogo Physio. We exist to help you get back to your physical best following injury. We want everyone who walks through the doors of Pogo Physio to complete their rehabilitation, get back to their physical best, and in doing so, cross their physio finish line. To get started on your rehabilitation journey, jump over to pogophysio.com.au and schedule your 1-hour initial appointment. If you're interstate or overseas, we also offer telehealth services which allow us to connect and help you get back to your physical best no matter where you are on the planet. For now, let's jump back with Dr. Jo Lukins, leading sports psychologist and author of The Elite, Think Like an Athlete, Succeed Like a Champion. Performance. On the performance side of things, certainly I think anyone that's out there that's tried to put their best foot forward, whatever the athletic endeavour, or any endeavour, has experienced anxiety. What would just be some of your headline tips around, what drives that anxiety, and then how to deal with it so it's productive rather than maybe deleterious to performance?
Yeah, that's a great question. So our minds are funny, aren't they? We have this. Our brain does all these fantastic things like keep us alive and a whole range of other things. And one of the other things that it does for us is generate self-talk. It's like our commentary on the world. And I think that commentary is incredibly important because it's what drives our decisions and helps us understand who we are. And, it's fantastic. And then every now and again, that voice, can get inside our minds and it can spin our wheels and we can think things that are helpful or we can think things that are less helpful. So there's no doubt in athletic performance we start off with expectations about how we might perform in a particular event, and then we kind of assess how that's going, and then based on that assessment, whether we think we're going to underperform or overperform, a whole heap of commentary goes with that. So I think that one of the biggest challenges and one of the strategies that I think is really useful for people, and we're only really starting to see a lot of the research in this area in psychology recently. Other philosophical views have been smart about this for a very long period of time, but psychology, it's taken us a little while to catch up, is a topic or is a strategy, I guess we can call it a strategy, which is called mindfulness. And for some people, they will be nodding their heads and be very familiar with mindfulness, and other people, I find when I give workshops, are kind of looking at me going, I've never heard that term before. But when we talk about being mindful, we talk about being aware of our present moment, whatever that moment might be. And mindfulness might be about being calm and being relaxed and bringing ourselves to a state where we can, have some control over our physiological responses and so forth. And mindfulness can be being at one of your Gold Coast theme parks about to get on an amazing roller coaster or something like that. And I must say some of my most mindful moments is, I know there was one that held us at 100 kilometres an hour for 20 seconds or something like that. And I can assure you that for the entire time I was on that ride, I was not, conjuring that afternoon shopping list or even worried about whichever child it was I had on the ride with me. It was a very mindful experience. So I think one of the things that can be really useful for us when we're going into an athletic endeavour is to be mindful about where we are, how we're going. And one of the things that mindfulness allows us to do is to be in the present. And most athletic performance is obviously performed in the present. I'm stating the obvious there, because our alternatives to being in the present is to either be in the past or to be in the future. Both have their place. So we want to reflect back on the past like we talked about before. You've just done an event, whatever it is, and you're thinking about how did that go? That is past thinking. You might be planning a holiday and you might be going to, let's say you're going to Japan and you went to Japan 3 years ago, and you might think about, well, how did that go 3 years ago when I went? What was good? What wasn't good? What would I repeat? What wouldn't I repeat? So past thinking has its place, absolutely. Future thinking has its place as well, so you might be playing rugby league and you might be 52 minutes into the game and the scores might be whatever they are, and then you're the captain of the team, so you're making decisions about plays and where you want to get the team to in a couple of tackles time or a couple of plays time or whatever it is. So there's times within our sport where it's really helpful. And there's that word again. You're going to hear me say helpful quite a lot. I say helpful and gratitude a lot. They're my two words. So it might be helpful. Might be helpful to think back. It might be helpful to think forward. Most of us, though, in our sporting domains, if we stick to sport for the moment for this example, most of us don't spend as much time in the present moment as we could. And so that's when we sometimes can, you sometimes see let's stick with a football example, you might see a player drop the ball and it was a sitter. They should have caught it. And what will happen is in that split second just before the ball reaches their hands, they move ahead too far, as to where they're going to run with the ball once they've caught it. And it's too late because they didn't catch it because they just dropped it, so they weren't mindful in the moment that the ball came into their possession. So mindfulness is one of those fantastic strategies that we can learn to help us control anxiety a little bit. It calms things down for us, helps us be in the moment. It gives us more space in our heads to think. And it doesn't matter whether you are a world-class athlete lining up at the start line of a 400 metres, say. It doesn't matter whether you are a 10-year-old going into a maths class at school and you have just played the best game of handball ever. That ability to shift from the past, which was morning tea, to the present is challenging, and it's a skill that we can all learn. So, I'm always saying to people, wherever you can practice the skill of mindfulness, you are benefiting your sporting experience.
Oh, wow. Gosh, that's terrific. I was informed recently that I should go for a walk instead of a run and leave my phone at home and actually just have a look around. It was called not a mindfulness walk, but a sensory walk, Dr. Jo. And I did it, and I actually went, oh, this is actually quite nice. So thank you for speaking to me.
There's a sky out there and trees and, all that sort of thing. Yeah, exactly. And it's interesting, exactly that example that you give. I was working with a group of teachers once, and one of them saw me the next day. And we have a fantastic walk that you can do here in Townsville, which is called Castle Hill. It's right in the middle of our city. It's about 25-minute walk up the hill. And she used to walk Castle Hill every single day after school. That was her kind of decompress after work before she went home. And she caught me and she said, Jo, I walked Castle Hill mindfully. I said, oh, did you? How did that go? And she said, it was amazing. Probably like your experience, Brad. She said, it's so noisy on the hill. You stand on twigs and you feel the sun on your back and you hear the birds and you notice the sky. And I said, oh, that's great. And then she said, and you'll probably laugh at this, she said, I am never doing that again. And I said, oh, what's that? And she said, it made me realise how mindful I was while I did it. But what I actually use the hill for, it's my strategy for the past and the future. She said, I walk up the hill and I spend the whole 25 minutes thinking about how did my day go? How did that art lesson go with the students? I didn't finish that thing in history and I need to make sure that I pick that up. And then what she would do is she'd get to the top of the hill, have a drink of water and walk down and plan her tomorrow. So she said to me, look, it was lovely. The mindfulness was lovely. But then I had to go home and do all that work. She said, so I have to be mindful enough as I walk up the hill that I don't, trip over a stick or, find some deposit left by a dog or something like that. I need to be mindful enough that I'm paying attention. She said, but for me, that space, she said, what I've realised is now what I do is I get up 20 minutes earlier each morning and I sit outside and do some meditation and be mindful that way. She said that's what works for me. But it's important that I guess the key lesson from that is finding ways that work for you that allow you to be mindful.
Terrific. I don't think I'll ever walk up and down a hill the same again. Absolutely great.
And the beauty of it is walk it mindfully or walk in the past and walk in the future. Just be careful while you do it. Do whatever works for you, but know that moments of mindfulness. So if you are a school teacher and you are walking into a classroom and you've got, 25 young minds about to look at you, you need to be on your game. You need to be mindful and in the moment. So if you've just had a tricky phone call at morning tea time, or if you're planning you've got to go and, sign some house documents or something in the afternoon, that's not helpful for performance, which is what teaching is. It's a performance. It's not helpful for what you're doing. So everybody benefits from that strategy of mindfulness, that if you can take those moments as you come and sit at your desk, or you pick up your kids from school, or you head into the gym and start doing your stretching, the more mindful you can be about the experience, one, the more you'll enjoy it, and two, you'll do it in a better way. Most people can relate to the fact, if you think about brushing your teeth this morning, working on the assumption that most listeners actually did that, did you do it mindfully? Did you stand there for the 2 or so minutes and very carefully brush the gums and all the rest of it? Or did you, like I sometimes do, wander around the house looking for lost hats and grabbing lunch boxes and all the rest of it? The difference between, dentists will tell you, the difference between brushing your teeth mindfully and doing it mindlessly is substantial. And if you do that every single day, you're either going to have great gums or you're going to spend a lot of time at the dentist.
There's 12 terrific chapters in The Elite, your recently published book. And I just want to dive, with the time we have on, just to pull out a little bit more around 2, and they're consecutive chapters, chapters 7 and 8. Chapter 7, Embrace the Suck. You touched on this earlier, the importance of being comfortable with the uncomfortable in terms of, seeking our best performance. Can you share a few tips around the key extracts from this chapter?
Yeah, so I really enjoy this topic because I think it's so pertinent to all of us with all the different things that we do. And I have to say the phrase itself was adapted from the military, because I do quite a bit of work with defence personnel here in Townsville. So there's a thing that's called mil-speak, which is military speak. And the notion of the suck in military terms is that sometimes you just have to do tasks that are not quite palatable. So it might be, and I'm going to oversimplify it, but it might be stand here for 2 hours, dig the hole, right now fill it in again. So sometimes you just got to do stuff and it's unpleasant. When I was a student at uni, I worked in a cafe and I used to clean dishes for 10 hours a day. It was not my most fun job that I ever had. What we find when we're competing in sport as well is that there are days when our training is not all rainbows and lollipops, that there are early mornings, there is lots of effort, there is hard work, and, to use an Australian expression, sometimes it sucks. And it does, and that's kind of the point. So, which is one of my mantras. One of my mantras is it's kind of the point. I went riding this morning, it was 4:30 and it was cold. So I would hope that I would be training with a level of intensity if I'm going to get up that early, and experience those conditions. So the notion to embrace the suck is to acknowledge that if you've got to do it anyway, find a way to make it palatable. So if you are doing some physical training and it's tough, then before you start it, tell yourself why you're there. Why are you doing this? So maybe this is your opportunity to get stronger. Maybe this is your opportunity to get faster. Maybe this is your opportunity to experience discomfort. So when you can do those things and you can embrace the suck rather than fight it, you don't burn as much mental energy in getting the task done. So one of the things that we do at the Army is that we talk about this concept and we look at some strategies and one of the key things you can do is, challenge and rephrase how you describe something. And I'm going to come back to my beautiful Castle Hill here in Townsville. I was walking up the hill one day and there were 2 fellows who came up behind me, and it was just the way we all walked towards the water cooler, is that they kind of walked either side of me. And one of them turned to the other one and just said, as they were coming past me, he said, "Oh, that was horrible." He said, "I hated that. That was so hard." And I think they had run up the hill, which is a tough thing to do. And he just said, "That was awful." And the other fellow actually had like an MP3 player on him, but they were playing the speakers out so that they could both hear it. And he turned to him, smiled, and said, "Yeah, I know, but now that we're at the top," he said, "we can dance." And he danced to the water cooler. And it was really good example of this was 2 men who had both gone through the same physical challenge. One of them had labelled it as horrible and uncomfortable and it sucked and it was awful, and the other one saw it as an opportunity to get to the top and dance. So they both had to do it anyway. But, in terms of as an experience, and one of the things that we know is that when you embrace an experience, and particularly when you're grateful for the experience, you tend to perform better. So there's some really interesting new research coming through about the benefits of gratitude for athletes, which isn't just about happiness, but it's about performance as well. So embracing the suck is really about your ability to acknowledge, well, if I'm going to do it anyway, I may as well find a way to make it palatable for me. Why is this a good session for me to be doing? How will this make me wiser at the end? So you can do some of those kind of things and then almost be grateful for the opportunity to go out there. We were talking before about injury. If we were injured, we'd all wish we could get up and do a tough training session. So, when we're a bit more grateful for why we're out there and what we're doing, we'll perform better.
If you missed last week's episode, an expert edition with leading sports scientist and pioneer of the polarized training method, Dr. Stephen Seiler, then here's a little snippet of what you missed.
That's part of the art of devising interval sessions is eventually you're going to get cooked. But if I'm prescribing a session and my goal is for them to get 30 or 40 minutes of work, then I got to make sure that, the intensity doesn't get so high that they quit a lot earlier than I expect them to.
To tune into the full episode and glean from the many teachings of Dr. Seiler, world-renowned and acclaimed sports scientist, jump over to wherever it is that you enjoy your podcast from, Spotify, SoundCloud, iTunes, or any of the popular podcast players. Whilst you're there, you may enjoy diving back through the podcast archives and looking at the featured performers, the expert editions, the interest editions, and the Coach's Corner editions, dating right back to episode 1 featuring surf lifesaving Ironman champion Ali Day. For now, let's jump back with Dr. Jo Lukins, sports psychologist, on this, an expert edition. Dr. Jo, Chapter 8, life balance BS. And, the sub-points that I have here around that are, you want it all and you don't know how. Spoiler alert, you can't have it all. And it gets worse. If you want to excel and you want complete balance, you are kidding yourself. That being said, you can still have a fulfilling life when striving for excellence. So can you speak to that, the concept of this chapter a bit more?
Yeah, I've got to say I'm not a big fan of that term work-life balance or life balance, because I do think it's a myth. I think the idea that we can have all the little pockets of our lives and them all balanced in a way that, everything works is a really nice idea. But I think it's far more of a theory than a practicality. And you've worked with a lot of high-performing athletes as well as I have, and my observation would be is that if you want to get to the pointy end of whatever it is that you're doing, it takes a fair bit of your time and a fair bit of your effort. So the notion that then everything else is going to balance out is probably a myth. And what I would also say is the notion of trying to chase that becomes a stress as well. So I think it's an acceptance of the fact that, achieving requires time and effort. And that, we may not be able... People debate about, can you have it all? I don't think you can have it all at once. It doesn't mean that you can't have it all, across your life and having different goals. But I think acceptance is a really key thing for people to do. And when you know what your values are and you make sure that your behaviours are consistent with it, when you're grateful to the people that are in your life, then you can be at peace with what you can achieve with what you have. And I think that's a really important thing. And it's much less about saying, well, I want this balanced life, and accepting that if I want to be the best, if that's your goal, then know that you're going to have to say no to some things or not be able to take on board every opportunity. And I think understanding that every decision has a consequence and being accepting of that is the mature pathway forward for, particularly in this case, for an athlete.
Gosh, so much wisdom there. So many teachings and learnings for us. Talking about, you use the phrase, if someone wants to be the best, and obviously that's very subjective, what is the best? But,
yes.
Someone that springs to mind in a sport that you've spent so much of your professional life working with, rugby league, here in Australia, is the gentleman that penned the foreword for your book, The Elite, Jonathan Thurston. From your observations of, JT, as Australia affectionately knows Jonathan as, what, from the observations you've had the time obviously working with Jonathan at times, Dr. Jo, what would you say are the attributes that has made someone like that so successful in his sporting life?
Yeah, look, I think Jonathan's a good example of, a very well-respected athlete, and just making observations on what probably everyone sees, in terms of what's out in the public domain and so forth. I think there's a whole range of reasons why Jonathan is an excellent athlete, and let's not pass on any of his abilities in terms of his physical skill, his physical fitness, technical skills, and simply time in the game. That with that deliberate practice, he really built up those skills. So certainly all of that. But I think the Jonathan that you see in the public arena is who he is, that what you see is a very grounded, humble person who's grateful for the opportunity. And I think that when you can do that, and we've seen that recently with a whole range of particularly female Australian athletes who just, talk about, who's in their corner and being grateful for the people around them and, never taking anything for granted. I think people who are able to do that, they're able to manage themselves well through their experiences. I think all of those attributes contribute to athletes who perform at a very high level.
Dr. Jo, finally, if we want to know more about some of these topics, learn more, I should say, through The Elite, where can we find the book? In stores, online, whereabouts?
Oh, thank you. Yes, so it is. You can get it through the usual online channels, so through Amazon. And wherever good iBooks are sold, I guess. But in terms of probably the easiest place to access it is actually through my website. So, and if you remember my name, you'll remember the website because it's drjolukins.com. And on there, there's physical copies of the book if you'd like one of those sent out to you, and there's also e-copies of the book as well. So depending on whether you prefer the hard copy in your hand or whether you prefer the e-book, whichever you prefer, you can access it through there. So people are very welcome to have a look and see if it's something that might be helpful for them.
Fantastic. And then consulting-wise, are you available for telehealth services, online consulting, or only in person there in Peak Psychology in Townsville?
No, I certainly do quite a bit of travel with the work that I do, and most of my work now is in the sort of workshop seminar space. I've done a lot of that over the years, and I just find that's the way I can sort of get to a broader audience. And I am actually in the process of developing some online courses and tools as well. So that's more of a watch this space, though I don't quite have that in place yet. But I'm going to base some modules on the actual chapters of the books themselves. So if people want to get into some of those topics a little bit further, it's a way of, watching some videos and so forth that you can do that. And certainly, I'm on all the usual flavours of social media. So if people want to get in contact through some of those forums, I'm always putting bits and pieces up on those to sort of share with people and just share information as well.
Brilliant. And we'll link that up in the show notes as well, Dr. Jo. And every guest of the show issues listeners with a physical challenge for the week. And, in this case, we open that up to be a psychological challenge, if you like, as well. So, Dr. Jo Lukins, Sports Psychologist, what's your challenge to listeners going to be for the week?
Well, I'm going to combine both the physical and the mental. I think that's probably a good way for us to do it. So what I would encourage listeners to do in their next training session is to really try to do it mindfully. So to bring the focus down to the moment that you're in, that whatever's happening in your life outside of your training, that what you want to do is just bring that focus within, it'll still be waiting for you when you're finished. So bring it to what you're actually doing, notice the physical movement, being mindful, and see how that changes for you as an experience. So really concentrating on that mindfulness.
Brilliant. And if you could boil everything you've learnt across your wide-spanning career with so many chapters of your career, let alone your book, what would be the one piece of single advice that you'd give to listeners of the show in terms of helping them perform at their best?
That is such a great question. Okay, so I'm going to say, so much that I would like. I'm going to come back to the gratitude. I think to be grateful for who you are, for who's around you, for what you can do, that when you are grateful for those things, you're always going to be onto a winner, regardless of whether or not that means you stand on a dais. I think that to win in life, it's about being grateful for who you are. You are enough. Be grateful for the people around you and really enjoy those experiences while you're engaged in them.
Oh, well, that sums up my experience in recording this with you. I am very grateful for your time, and I know listeners of the show will be, Dr. Jo. There's so much in there, so thank you for sharing just some of the many lessons that you could impart upon us today.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for having me.
So there you have it, another episode of the Physical Performance Show, and I trust you enjoyed Dr. Jo Lukins' sharings today. If you did, then please let Dr. Jo know. You'll find Dr. Jo over on Instagram at Dr_Jo, Jo_Lukins, Lukins. Please let Dr. Jo know what it was that you enjoyed or the top learning that you took away. You can also do that via a Podsy. That's a screenshot of the episode that you're enjoying at any given time. They are a lot of fun, so please keep them coming. Be sure to tag in the show at Physical Performance Show on Instagram, and please keep them coming. If you'd like to provide feedback to myself on how we can improve the show, then you're also welcome to seek me out on social media at Brad_Beer, Instagram or Twitter, or shoot me an email, b.beer@pogophysio.com.au. A massive thanks, as always, to you, the show listener, for making this show possible. A huge thanks to those that have been hitting subscribe. That is the best way to help this show grow, to reach the earbuds of more people who, just like yourself, are looking to enjoy and pursue their own physical best. If you know someone who could benefit from Dr. Jo's sharings today, then please share the episode with them. That would mean a lot as well. Thank you to those leaving reviews and ratings over on iTunes. I read them all, and they all mean something to myself and the team. A big thanks this week to Laura Peel. Laura rated the show 5 stars and commented, "Thanks for all the consistent and informative information the show provides and the amazing guests. It's a great show for both listening and gleaning helpful tips for improving performance." Laura, thank you for taking the time to leave that review. If you'd like to leave one yourself, it really means a lot. Jump over to iTunes and rate or review or both away. As always, a huge thank you to today's show sponsor, PhysioCrem. Podcasts are free to download, however, they are not free to produce. So PhysioCrem, thank you for your support of today's episode. Don't forget the fantastic offer for 20% off PhysioCrem supplies. You can jump over to physiocrem.com.au. Huge thanks to the great team who make this show possible each and every week. Daryl Misson, our audio engineer, Susan Wilkin, all things show administration, Matthew Walding, all things show graphic design, and Oliver Crossley, behind the scenes input. Now, coming up on next week's episode of the Physical Performance Show, we keep this expert edition theme running. I'll bring you a conversation that I recently had with advanced accredited sports dietitian Chloe McLeod. Chloe is the founder of the FODMAP Challenge, and we take a deep dive into all things gut health and how it affects not only health, but also athletic performance. We talk about all things gut intolerances, gut health, FODMAP diets, anti-inflammatory foods, and so much more. So be sure to be tuning in next week for another expert edition featuring Chloe McLeod. Until then, keep pursuing your physical best performance. I'm Brad Beer, and this has been the Physical Performance Show.